Good morning. It's good to see everybody's awake this morning. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about faith and science and how I work with those disciplines. I'm a biology professor at Seattle Pacific University. When I'm starting my lectures with my students, I jokingly kind of suggest occasionally that I think they should take up smoking. Seems like a reasonable idea, doesn't it? And the reason is, quite a rational explanation I've got for this. Folks who smoke tend to die younger, and they tend to die of diseases that are relatively inexpensive to treat. So we're going to save a lot of money for Medicare and Social Security if more kids would take up smoking. Right? There's nothing unscientific about that claim. I've not said anything that science could deny. We have to look someplace else to figure out why smoking is not a good idea for young people today. Okay? So, is there really a fundamental disagreement between faith and science, between religion and science, if you like? There's some authors that would tend to say, yes, faith and science are completely incompatible. Some of you may have heard of Richard Dawkins, an English evolutionary biologist, who suggests that they are, that you can't understand science today and believe that God exists. On the other hand, the late Stephen Jay Gould, an evolutionary biologist from Harvard, he described science and religion as non-overlapping magisteria. That is, different domains of knowledge. Gould has a really eloquent classic quote. He says, science is about the ages of rock. Religion is about the rock of ages. Personally, Gould had doubts about the existence of the rock of ages. He wasn't a devout theist. He was an agnostic. But he recognized the difference in the discipline. Okay. So who's right, Dawkins or Gould? It turns out when Dawkins claimed that science disproves the existence of God, philosophers, sorry, it's a tough word for me to say, philosophers of science have pilloried him for making that claim. Alvin Plantinga from Notre Dame said to call Dawkins' reasoning sophomoric was an insult to college sophomores everywhere. So to understand why Dawkins is wrong and there is no contradiction, it's helpful to step back from science and faith and look at what I'll call philosophy, what someone that's more pretentious might call epistemology. How do we know what we know? What are the presuppositions of science? What do we assume? What are the primary bases for religion? Both have them, and they matter. Okay? So for science, one of the things that, as a scientist, I assume is what we call natural causality. Basically, things I observe in nature have natural rather than supernatural causes. That inherently means, because I'm assuming that's true, that I can't make tests, I can't do experiments about the supernatural. I can't design an experiment to test whether God exists or not. It's out of bounds for me. Miracles can't be scientifically proved or disproved. I can't tell you as a scientist that something is miraculous, and I can't tell you it's not. It's just not my field of play. When I get a test result in my laboratory, I don't know for sure if angels and demons were manipulating the experiment or not. It's just not my call to make. That's not what I would do as a scientist. I assume they're not. I assume that other folks would get the same response in the lab that I did, which leads to a second principle of science. Science has as one of its principles what we call common perception. We tend to agree. We tend to come to conclusions where we all agree. Part of that is we can't hide data. I can't hide my data and say I've come to a conclusion without sharing it. You shouldn't trust my conclusion if I don't share the data with you, right? It kind of gets interesting. Some of you may work in fields where there's proprietary data, perhaps developing new drugs and so on, where the data aren't shared with the broader community. I was talking with a friend of mine, Rod Stiling. He's a historian of science at Seattle Pacific, and asking him about this. Is this really science in the way science, as a historian of science, would understand it, and as the ideas of science came to be, or not? And Rod kind of laughed, and he pointed out that there was a word for that when science was being used in the Middle Ages and late Dark Ages to mean different things. There was this sort of proprietary knowledge that one healer would pass on only to their apprentice and no one else. And there was a word for that. It was not science. It was not the word that was used for science. It was magic. So that sort of hidden knowledge was magic, spelled with a K back then. Okay. There's other wonderful fields where we don't have common perception. Art is one of them. You and I can disagree about what the world's greatest piece of art is. We can see value in multiple different aspects of art. That's okay. Science also assumes uniformity in space and time. And that means that the results I get today, the patterns I see today, you should be able to see somewhere else in the world and would see if you were to do the experiment at some future date. Okay. Again, if we think of miracles or God acting in the world as being rare exceptions to the laws of nature, then I can't test for them. They're out of bounds for me. You have to look for something else. Okay? So that's science. That's how we determine whether something is in bounds for science. What about theology or religion? That's going to vary a bit, and I'm very reticent to talk about that. We've got multiple ordained Methodist ministers and a professor of theology in the audience. You can ask about those first principles. But I'll throw a few ideas out there. Some folks talk about sola scriptura for the Lutheran traditions. In Methodist churches, you may hear people talk about the Wesleyan quadrilateral and so forth. The Pope speaking ex cathedra, what that means for Catholicism and so on. Even to say that God doesn't exist is a presupposition of atheism. You have to sort of assume that that is true before you move on. Okay? All right, so there's basically a problem in trying to claim that science disproves the existence of God. We just can't test for that. Okay? That's all good, but that's all that airy-fairy philosophical mumbo-jumbo. I'm a scientist, I'm not a philosopher. I want to see data. So the data for me is, are there scientists out there who are theists, who are Christians, who believe God exists? Okay? And the answer is definitely so. The former director of the Human Genome Project and currently the head of the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins, has been described as the most devout believer I have ever known. And Francis Collins is a little bit unusual. He did not grow up as a Christian, and he did not, as some Christians have done, he did not lose his faith as he got into graduate school and started studying biology. Rather, he actually became a Christian. He was a convert to Christianity in graduate school when he was in the depth of his scientific research. Okay. Even so, Dr. Collins understands there are sharp boundaries between science and faith, and unequivocally says that religion has no place in a science classroom, despite being a devout Christian himself. He is very definitely in Gould's camp of seeing these ideas as being non-overlapping magisteria, different concepts, faith and science. John Rock is another interesting example. He's a devout Roman Catholic. He was also instrumental in developing birth control pills, which may seem a little counterintuitive to you. He was actually hoping to find a method of birth control that would be viewed as natural by manipulating hormones rather than an artificial barrier. So he was looking at using his faith as he understood it to develop that method of birth control. Okay. Historically, one of the most interesting evolutionary geneticists of the 20th century was Theodosius Dobzhansky. Dobzhansky started his education in Russia during the Russian Revolution, eventually emigrated to the United States in 1927. He was also a Russian Orthodox Christian. Now, this gets interesting because in the late 1960s and early 1970s, there were some Christians who were fundamentalists, were responding to ideas of evolution and the evidence for evolution, and their response was that, well, God must be testing our faith by creating things that make it look like evolution had happened. Dobzhansky didn't buy into that. And he didn't buy into it not because he was a scientist. He didn't reject the idea because he was a scientist. He rejected it because of his faith. He thought it was theologically heretical to call God a liar by saying God would create evidence that was not true. He accused people of holding that view not of being bad scientists or being scientifically illiterate, but being blasphemous. It's not very often you hear a scientist calling somebody blasphemous. That's interesting. Let me ask you all this question. Who came up with the idea of evolution by natural selection? Anybody know? I'm a professor. I ask my students questions. You've got to help me out here. Charles Darwin, yeah, that famous plant physiologist, Charles Darwin. You didn't know he did plant physiology, did you? Should work on your botany. He's a very widely exploring scientist. However, Darwin realized his ideas were going to be potentially problematic and create issues for society. And so he didn't publish his work for 25 years until a gentleman named Alfred Russel Wallace came to the same conclusions that Darwin had. Darwin, as you may know, worked in the Galapagos. Wallace worked in Indonesia. Island groups out in the ocean that came to the same conclusions. Wallace himself grew up as a Church of England member as a child. He rejected Christianity early on, but was always a theist, a creator. He believed in a creator God, although more of a Unitarian. In older days, people like Isaac Newton, Galileo, the famous scientists we've all heard of, were motivated by their faith to study science. Okay? Now, having said that, having viewed science and faith as being non-overlapping magisteria, we can ask the question, do they ever abut? Do they ever inform each other? And that's definitely true. When that happens, though, it's critical that science stick to its presuppositions and not allow other factors to come in and predetermine the answers. When that happens, the results can be really catastrophic. Now, what might predetermine a scientific answer might be some religious views, as we would see today with fundamentalism at times, but they can easily be non-religious views, political motivations, philosophies of life, if you like. I'll give you an example of one of those. It's a really sad story. How many of you have heard of Trofim Lysenko? Anybody ever heard of Lysenko? Maybe, yeah. Well, a few of you have. Lysenkoism was a policy in the Soviet Union during the 1930s. Trofim Lysenko was a good communist, good socialist. He knew that what you inherited from your parents couldn't affect you. That wasn't a good communist thing to say, that what you got from your parents mattered. It was what was your environment. Your environment would determine what would become of you. And that applied to plants grown in the field. And so Lysenko rejected all manner of artificial selection, we'd call it, plant breeding to try to improve yields and so on. He said, no, you can plant any seeds anywhere. You just make sure it's got the right fertilizers, the right soil conditions, and the plants will grow. Crops failed, people starved in the Soviet Union at that time because of Lysenkoism. The horrific results. Scientists were fired and sent to Siberia for daring to question Lysenkoism, even when the data were showing it wasn't working. It was failing as an agricultural policy. So, bad stuff. In Nazi Germany, we were fortunate. Hitler was so blindly devoted to his anti-Semitism that he rejected Albert Einstein's Jewish science, and that delayed the development of nuclear weapons in Germany at that time. We were lucky that the Nazis weren't good scientists. They didn't stick to those presuppositions. Okay. Unfortunately, we see the same pattern today in U.S. culture. The political right gets ridiculed, and rightly so, for the issue of climate change, as Pastor Rich pointed out. But the political left doesn't get a pass either. We can be blind to what the science is showing us if we predetermine what the outcome must be. Okay. Could be questions like climate change, vaccination of children, whether marijuana use is a relatively safe recreational activity or the cause of all the ills of our time, the utility of nuclear power, how many sexes or genders exist. These are all examples where dogma can blind people to the science. So it's really critical when we're doing science that we stick to those presuppositions and let the data guide us. Okay. Now, faith can't dictate the answers for science, but faith can guide us to moral actions based on what we learn from science. I can tell you, I think the catastrophic results of climate change will be morally bad. We should try to prevent them. That's not a good thing. We need philosophy and theology to help us out in making that conclusion. There's several non-religious scientists who have very plainly said that the problems with the environment today, the crises we face, need a spiritual solution, not a scientific one. Another question. Get yourselves and your kids vaccinated, please. That's important. Minimize fats and simple sugars in your diet, right? Don't use drugs recreationally. It's probably not a good idea. Science can't tell you to do these things, only what the results are likely to be if you do them. You need to determine what is a good answer, what's a good result, what is morally appropriate. A longer life, a healthier life. These are things I would say are good. That's not because I'm a scientist, okay? And yes, don't start smoking. Despite the benefits to the federal budget, I don't think that's a morally good thing to do. Okay. Now, on the other hand, scientific observations of nature can't always shape our faith. There's several reasons for this. One of them is that scientific conclusions are always tentative. Scientists have this bad habit of self-correcting. So if you end up building some theological statement based on the science of today, well, 10 years from now, that may be quite different. Okay. Fundamentalists have an unfortunate pattern of seeing something in science they can't explain and inserting God as the explanation for that gap, that hole. The problem is those holes eventually get filled in, and that restricts God to a smaller and smaller part of the puzzle. Okay. For me, as a Christian, I see God as ordaining natural laws, and thus when those holes get filled in, my response is, oh, wow, that's how God did it. And that's a response I see in a lot of my fellow Christians who are scientists. Okay. The story of the Magi, I love this story. It's a great metaphor. Pagan astrologers looked at nature and found God. I mean, I'm a Christian who's a scientist. What could be better than that, right? The problem is with that is that there are plenty of times when we may not want to look to nature for morality. The Bible's full of lovely metaphors as well about when that does work. We look at hens sheltering the baby chicks. We see from a nature example of these birds that mate for life. We see seahorses, male seahorses that guard their eggs and so on. But we don't talk about the idea that the eggs in that nest of the birds that mate for life have multiple fathers. That's when we tend to gloss over. Or that, sadly, oftentimes some of those birds will kill their young. That's how nature works sometimes. Okay? So just because we see a pattern in nature, we don't want to necessarily draw deeper meanings for human morality from that pattern because it's coming from nature. Okay? Good example of this, Albert Einstein's theory of relativity entered popular culture. It was attributed as causing everything from cubism in art to moral relativism. Einstein was appalled by that. He had very clear and absolute moral convictions and had no time for that connection. He didn't want his work connected with that philosophy at all. So, kind of in summary, I just want to emphasize 3 main points here. It's a sermon, it's got to be 3 points, right? There is no inherent conflict between faith and science. They're different subjects. They're different ways of understanding the world. Okay? Science can't give us moral judgments. At best, it's going to give us data from which we can make these determinations. And on the other hand, dogma, whether it's religious or political, left or right, can't determine what the answer is for science. That can be very dangerous and lead to things like famines and destruction. So, all right. Well, I will thank you for your time. If you guys have any questions after class, you're welcome to catch me in the auditorium.